unearthly quiet.
Okay, everybody ready to start back with the cross of Dr. Hope's?
Yes, Your Honor. Kendall Coffey for the plaintiffs, including the teachers.
All right, sir, you may proceed.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Dr. Hopes. I hope you're feeling better. You had a surgical procedure yesterday morning, is that right?
Yes, I had a small procedure this morning, but it's a lot better than it was yesterday and better than it was the day before.
Okay. Just curious, when were you first contacted by the state defendants about being a witness in this case?
I think it was either Sunday or Monday.
Yeah. I spoke to you Sunday, right? You remember that? And I spoke to you Monday. You didn't mention that you expected to be a witness for the state, right?
I did not. I let you know that the state had been in touch with me.
Yeah, and in fact,
when we had that conversation, I informed you that I had conversations with their counsel, and that that I would not be able to discuss the case with you because I was going to read the complaint. That's correct.
Yeah, well, let's go through it a little bit. I spoke to you Sunday, and you said you had a lot of problems with what the state was doing. And in fact, in one of our conversations, you said that you didn't think that the state was going about it the right way, and they really should spend the next few months getting it right and then open for in-class education, like beginning of the new year. Do you remember telling me that?
That is absolutely not what I said.
Okay. And do you remember telling Pat Barber, the head of the teachers, that you didn't think that the schools around Florida were ready to open? Do you remember that conversation?
I do not think that's a characterization of that conversation.
Okay. You describe yourself as an extraordinary leader in education and healthcare, right?
Yes, sir. That's what other people think.
You received appointments from, I think, Governor Bob Martinez, Governor Jeb Bush, and Governor Rick Scott. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you consider Commissioner Corcoran to be, I think you said, a very good friend.
Yes.
And just so I'm clear, you believe you have been a leader in creating a community health campaign for the Manatee school system. Is that right?
I think that's correct.
Okay. And just so I have some sense of it, when did that campaign begin?
The initiation of the process was at the board meeting where we had the county health department, when the board voted to move forward with submitting our plan. So it would have been sometime in, I'd have to look at the board minutes.
Okay. Well, let's go through some of the board meetings and some of your comments. So the community campaign began really just, I don't know, 5-6 weeks ago, right?
I think it went live. We had a press conference when it went live. The development of it started sooner than that.
Mm-hmm. And you follow the media, including the media that talks about you. Is that correct?
Depends on what you refer to as following it.
You read it, right? Bradenton.com. You've seen what they've said about some of your comments and your role as a Manatee School Board member?
I have read some of their comments and some of their articles, yes.
Okay, and we can just sort of go through a couple of these and see what we can remember. You remember in July 8th saying that, make no mistake, we have community spread. You remember saying that?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Okay. So there was in fact, and I guess is in fact, community spread in Manatee County. Is that right?
A lot less of it now after the campaign has been in operation for more than 2 weeks.
Okay. And we'll talk about the campaign, but you remember also saying that
You're talking about a campaign. Can you tell me specific? Which campaign? Because there's more than one. There's one with the county commission and Commissioner Servia. There's the mascot manatee. So I'm not sure what campaign you're referring to, Mr. Coffey.
I'm just using a word from your various press stories about you, but we'll go specifically question by question. Do you remember on about July 8th saying that a plan should include in-person and online classes as originally planned until the number of infections dropped in Manatee County? Do you remember saying that on or about July 8th?
Your Honor, can we see?
I don't know what you're referring to.
I'm just asking what he remembers. I can certainly pull up articles, Judge, if that'll refresh the witness's recollection. These are public comments. Let me see if I can get the July 8th article. But this is all.
Were these statements, you said public statements, were these statements made at a board meeting?
Let's see. Well, let me just ask you if you ever made the statement in July, on or around July 8th, that the plan should include, in terms of the Corcoran order, in-person and online classes until the number of infections dropped in Manatee County. Do you recall making such a statement? And we'll try to pull up the article now. I'm just asking if you recall.
Mr. Coffey, I make numerous statements. If most of my statements, because of my current health condition, have been made online in public board meetings. I do not rely on the press as a documentation of my exact comments. So if I don't know what you're referring to. I'm a public official. I'm on many news stations. So to pin it down to a date, I don't know.
Okay. Well, maybe ask it a different way. Isn't it a fact that as of July 8th, you believe that the school opening plan should rely on in-person and online classes until the number of infections dropped in Manatee County? Now, just asking if you remember making such a statement.
Around July 8th, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if I made a statement towards that effect.
Okay. And then let me ask you about another statement. Referring to 50,000 students and thousands of employees in the district. If you recall saying around that time, if each one of those individuals only has contact with 4 people in the community, our school community basically has contact every day with over half the population of Manatee County. Do you remember saying that?
I probably made that comment then, and I made that comment in early March with the director of the county health department.
In fact, you made it to me a couple of days ago too, didn't you?
I may have.
Okay. And here's a comment that you might have remembered. I love research, but I'm not about to use the Manatee County School District for a study of how quickly you can spread the virus this fall.
Yes, that at a board meeting.
Sure. And do you remember trying to get a recommendation, meaningful recommendations from the health department, including Dr. Bensi, and them telling you they work for the governor? And
I do recall that.
Right. And in fact, when you first tried to get a recommendation from them, they weren't giving you a recommendation. Isn't that a fact?
I believe that was probably the case.
Yeah. But you've got significant connections and you're able to access people in Tallahassee in order to get things moving for the good of Manatee County. Is that right?
I believe so.
Okay. And in fact, your district, because of your experience as an epidemiologist and the contacts and resources you were being able to bring in and deploy put Manatee County way ahead of other districts in the state. Isn't that a fact?
I believe that may be shown to be true.
Okay. And just again, if you see if this is a comment that you can remember making. Yeah, we're trying to get me back on the screen, Doctor. The way this pandemic is behaving, we're going to be dealing with it until the end of the year at least. Fair enough? You said that?
I believe I did.
And it's still true, isn't it?
I think it's very true.
And there have been reported COVID exposures at least 3 Manatee County public schools and a public charter school already. Is that right?
Sounds about right.
You believe that N95 masks are necessary for students and teachers, don't you?
I believe an N95 is the best protection for an individual if others are not wearing. It's definitely, the N95 mask is the best way to prevent the contracting the disease through the air, regardless of whether somebody else is, if somebody else is not wearing a mask.
Okay, I'm going to try to, and this is not to suggest that you're contradicting yourself. It's just to help refresh your recollection. I'm going to put on the screen, for the purpose, Your Honor, of refreshing the witness's recollection, an article, and if I can we identify the article? I'm speaking to my colleagues. July 8th article, just skim down so we can put the reference language. Now this is paraphrasing you. It doesn't say, it isn't quoting you word for word, but it says, as of Tuesday afternoon, said a full and safe return to school would have to include N95 masks, along with eye and hand protection for employees and students. Do you see that language, Dr. Hopes?
I see the language.
Does it refresh your recollection? Did you say words to that effect on July?
I, as you said, it's a paraphrase.
Okay, but it's an accurate paraphrase, isn't it?
I don't know. I would have to refer to that. Had it been taken for a board meeting, I would have to refer to the board minutes.
Okay, then and just kind of a similar comment you made that's quoted in August 10th. I expect COVID to be with us for the entire school year. That's an accurate expression of your opinion, correct, Doctor?
Yes, sir.
And not to imply too much modesty, but it says we probably have a little bit of a head start. I believe our district is probably the only school district in Florida that has an experienced epidemiologist on the board and maybe in the country. You recall saying words to that effect?
Yes, sir, I do.
And would you agree that to wear masks, to protect each other, maintain social distancing, that's going to be difficult, especially for our children, but more so for our adolescents? Would you agree with that statement, Dr. Hopes?
No, we in Manatee County have already proven that not to be the case, that they are capable of wearing masks and social distancing.
Okay, so see if we can pull up the August 10 article. Well, you know, things evolve. So let's see if, let's pull up the quote and see if it refreshes your recollection as to whether you made this statement. Can you take a look at the statement? I'm going to ask it be, you know, I don't know if it's easy to read or not. I'll read it just so it's clear. This is to refresh your recollection, Dr. Hopes. Because of not having, you know, a silver bullet to identify who is carrying the virus and is contagious, we all have to assume that everyone is. Do you recall whether you made that statement, Doctor?
Yes, I believe I did make that statement.
Okay. Therefore, wear masks, protect each other, maintain that social distancing, and that's going to be difficult for especially our children, but more so for our adolescents. Do you see that?
Yeah, just like learning to drive a car is difficult at first.
Right. But you did make that statement, correct?
I appears that I probably did because it's probably a transcript from a news recording.
Okay. And then they don't like being in a bubble. And now we have to put them in one. So it's going to be interesting to see how they emotionally handle it. You see that?
No, I see what? I fortunately I was looking at a picture of me.
Okay.
And we have an option for students that aren't able to wear a mask. It's called e-learning.
The question was really about adolescence and the ability of adolescents to maintain throughout a school year particular safety protocols. And my understanding is you acknowledge the difficulty in getting adolescents to maintain safety protocols because they're kids. Fair enough?
It's a difficult challenge, but it's overcome. You can overcome it. We do it every day. That's how adolescents learn.
Would it be correct to say, this is another quote that's been attributed to you: I don't care what the governor says. I don't care what the head of the Senate says. This is a problem and we don't have a handle on it. Talking about the COVID virus and the development.
I suspect that sometime during this pandemic, I certainly may have made that comment.
And do you remember saying that the Surgeon General of Florida doesn't have specific metrics to guide the school district? Do you remember that? Saying that?
I have probably said that on more than one occasion.
And so it falls on local districts to decide what will happen if an outbreak occurs. That sound like, is that something you can accept as a statement you made?
Yes, I think that's probably supported in state statutes and the Constitution.
Do you know whether or not Commissioner Corcoran stated to school superintendents that before any schools are closed, they have to check with him first?
I was not party to that conversation.
Okay, you don't know one way or the other, is that correct?
That's what I'm saying, that's correct.
Okay. Just a few more, Dr. Hope. So thanks for bearing with me. I know you've probably had an uncomfortable couple of days due to the medical issue. You know how many schools, districts in the state of Florida have the resources and the actually the leadership that Manatee County has with respect to addressing the pandemic? And I said resources as well as the sophisticated leadership.
No, as I sit here, I would have to go county by county and think of who I know and what part of the state they're in and what their tax base is and what their reimbursement from the state is.
But I think you said in response to one of Mr. Wells's questions that you believe Manatee does have the resources to get it done right, correct?
We do, and I think other districts have the same capacity to develop a plan that meets their district's needs, and we all have the same capacity to express our needs to the federal government and the state, and the order from the commissioner spells out that we can have access to financial resources to support our plan.
I'm sorry, the order of the commissioner provides, it spells out what about financial resources?
I think that the order anticipates that there are additional needs that districts have, and those resources are available through the CARES Act and many other government programs to ensure that school districts have access to resources, including human resources as well as supplies, in order to open schools as safely as possible.
Just see if I've got any more questions for you. Is it, you talked about the 1 and 4, or one could be 4 contacts in the community as a realistic dynamic in terms of the necessary strategies for the COVID. You recall that, each?
I really don't understand your statement or your question.
Okay, let me go back to it.
Rephrase it, or?
Sure. If each one of those individuals only has 1 contact with 4 people in the community, our school community basically has contact every day with over half the population of Manatee County. You recall that? We talked about that before.
Yes, that's correct. And I had that discussion with the health department team in early March.
Okay.
That's where that comment came from, in early March.
Okay. I think it's quoted in July 8th, but that.
Yeah, and those numbers still hold true. I've used that numerous times as one way to motivate the community to understand why it's important that we follow these CDC guidelines to reduce the spread in Manatee County, which we have done.
And when you talk about the individuals who can be spreading 1 to 4, you're including teachers as well as students, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And we referred briefly to metrics, the fact that the Surgeon General was not providing metrics. And you also mentioned, I believe one of the comments was about getting the infection rate down. Was it your belief that the positivity rate is a meaningful metric in terms of assessing COVID spread and COVID prevention measures?
Not independently, no.
Okay. So, for example, you don't think it's relevant whether or not Manatee gets below a 5% positivity rate. Is that correct?
Not as a single measurement, no.
What are the other measurements that you think are important?
There are a number of them. Hospitalizations, incidence and prevalence. A positivity rate is just a number based on the number of people tested in a given period or in a given day, and the number that are tested positive. We don't know how that population was tested. We don't know whether they were adversely selected or self-selected. That number is a number that got put out there, not for opening schools.
Yeah.
That has never been tested.
Do you believe we have enough science to know what the long-term implications are for children who contract the coronavirus?
Would you restate that, please?
Do we know long-term what the potential harm might be to children who contract the coronavirus?
And how are you using the term long-term? What are we talking about in time?
Months, years, whatever long-term means to you as an epidemiologist.
But you're asking the question.
What will be the impact on children today who contract the coronavirus? Does science really have those answers yet? Or are we still trying to learn about it as information evolves?
I think as time evolves, we're learning more and more about this particular SARS strain.
And its impact on children?
Yeah, it's fun. It's being studied. Yes, it is being studied.
Okay. Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Redirect.
I'm just making sure there's nobody else. Yes, so Dr. Hopes, do you believe that the coronavirus is a serious concern?
I do. It's a pandemic.
And as Mr. Coffey asked you, and I think you committed to, you think that the coronavirus is going to be around at least until the end of this school year. Is that correct?
I believe that to be so.
You're an epidemiologist. You're certainly familiar with the consequences of things like coronavirus.
Yes, sir, I am.
Why do you feel that it is safe to offer bricks and mortar schools to the students in Manatee County and to have teachers in Manatee County then, if you think coronavirus is still going to be here?
As I mentioned before, that's probably the number one motivation in determining that risk versus benefit to open the schools. The coronavirus is not going to be extinguished next month in the United States or the world, and we have children whose futures depend on education. I spoke about my involvement with SARS in 2002 and 2003, which started again in China and Asia. And we have to deal with the reality. And that's why, you have options of how to deliver the critical education. We project the number of prison beds needed based on the number of third grade children that are not reading at grade level. That's a scary statistic. And
I'm sorry.
we have a way to minimize the risk and ensure that those children continue to get the education they need to succeed in life.
Let me ask you this. Mr. Coffey asked you about masks and concern about adolescents with masks. Why did you go to the trouble of involving the community in this concept of Mask Up Manatee?
To use, as I mentioned, the leverage and the statements that Mr. Coffey was relaying, putting reality out there, in fact, has motivated the community. And our adolescents are wearing masks, and those that are wearing masks, when they see a friend that's not wearing a mask, they ask them to wear a mask.
You've been Manatee County for some time now, school board for some time now. Do you have friends that are teachers?
Absolutely.
Do you have friends whose children are going to your school?
Yes, many.
Going to your school in person?
Yes,
Do you believe it's safe enough for them to be there to open up the school and go forward?
I do.
Are you putting up your friend teachers and your friends' children as some kind of a fancy experiment for the governor of Florida?
No, sir.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hopes. You are free to leave now.
Could I have one question of recross?
Sure.
Okay. You agree with the following statement, Dr. Hopes? And so that I'm not being holding anything back, it refers to a quote to you. This is not your annual flu. This is a new bug in the human population. We don't know how long it stays in your body. We don't know what kind of problems it causes into the future. Do you agree with that statement, Doctor?
I believe I made that statement.
Okay. Nothing. Thank you, Your Honor. Nothing else.
Anything further, Mr. Wells, from your side?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, Dr. Hopes. You are free to leave. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Call your next witness.
Your Honor. Are you ready? Okay. Let's just go on.
Who's the next witness from the defense?
Oh, it's Jacob Oliva. Sorry, Your Honor.
Okay. I see Mr. Oliva's name, but I don't see Mr. Oliva.
If he's not on in a second, we'll call, Your Honor. Actually, we're doing that right now. Can you bring me some water, please? Thanks. Be dry in a minute. Oh, there we go.
Okay, great. Mr. Oliva, if you'd raise your right hand, please. Mr. Oliva, if you'd you take yourself off mute. And raise your right hand, please.
We're still on mute.
Still on mute, it looks like. There you go.
Okay.
You go. You swear the testimony you give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do.
Thank you, sir. You can put your hand down.
Please tell us who you are.
My name is Jacob Oliva, and I am the Chancellor for the Division of Public Schools for the Florida Department of Education.
What do you do as the Chancellor of the Division of Public Schools for the Florida Department of Education?
Well, here in the department, I oversee 12 different bureaus that provide direct support for not only the students in our schools, but for the educators across the state of Florida, as well as support state board priorities, implementing the strategic plan, legislative issues, policy discussions, and budgets, but primarily make sure that we have the right conditions in place to set 2.8 million students in public schools up for success across about 4,000 different school campuses.
How long have you been the Chancellor, Mr. Oliva?
This is my third year in the Department of Education, and I've been serving in the capacity as the Chancellor for just over a year.
Tell us a bit about your education.
So I'm a product of the Miami-Dade public school system, where I was a proud Killian Cougar and transitioned up the coast and received an associate in arts degree in education from it was Daytona Beach Community College at the time. It's now Daytona State College. Continued on and further received a bachelor's degree in elementary education and exceptional student education, a dual major from Flagler College. Began my teaching career at the elementary level, primarily serving students with disabilities in kindergarten through third grade in different capacities. Went in to pursue higher education and received a master's degree from Nova Southeastern University, where I transitioned my professional career into administration. I've been lucky to serve as an elementary school principal, a high school principal, and while I was a high school principal, I was working on some doctoral level coursework, and I'm considered at the status of all but dissertation through the University of North Florida in educational leadership, and was able to join the district level and serve as a district level administrator as well as a school superintendent before joining the department. Throughout my educational career, it's expanded about 20 years in public schools.
What different counties had you served in?
Primarily in Flagler schools. That's where I began my student internship and was able to get hired on in that school district as a teacher and moved up through the ranks there locally.
What involvement did you have, sir, in the recommendation in March 2020 that the public schools in Duval, Duval County, in Florida be closed?
So early in March, we began having some high-level conversations with senior leadership here at the state level, which includes our chief of staff, our commissioner, our senior chancellor, as well as other state level experts when we were watching the spread of the COVID pandemic evolve across the globe. And we started seeing cases here in Florida, and we began direct conversations with school districts almost on a daily basis, primarily school superintendents, district level leaders, to provide the most current updates and data that we've received. And as we were moving forward with making planning decisions. I was serving in that capacity as an advisory person to senior leadership, as well as a direct contact with district level school administrators and leaders to find out what was happening in the local school districts as well.
So you worked directly with the local school superintendents, part of coming up with that, part of working on the team that came up with that recommendation.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, at the time the recommendation was made to close the schools down, what was the anticipated timeline? What was everybody, at least on your side of the table, thinking would happen?
Well, as we were looking at the models and the projections of the spread of the pandemic and the statewide impact that it could have, as well as some executive orders which looked at different phases of the state to be moved into. Early in March, probably by the second week of March, most of our schools were either on spring break or getting ready to go on spring break. And we knew that there was this term out there called flattening the curve, and that we needed to do our part to slow down and mitigate the spread. And the recommendation to kind of close Florida schools or recommend turning and pivoting our schools to closure was immediately only thought that was going to last a couple weeks. We were very optimistic and hopeful that when schools were going to go on spring break, we were going to ask them to extend that spring break. And the thinking at that time is within 2-3 weeks, we would have seen some of those models turn a little bit better. The curve would have been flattened. We would have minimized people that need to go to the hospital and take up the beds and do our part to mitigate the spread. And by May, we'd be able to welcome our students back into our classrooms and properly close out the school year.
Is it just me hearing this feedback? Sorry, Your Honor, I just was getting some bad feedback there.
Heard it too.
During this period of time, Mr. Oliva, were you in contact with the school superintendents, following up on this concept of are we going to go back? When are we going to go back?
Yes, so it was very early on when we were looking at the possible impact of COVID in Florida schools and starting to have questions about whether or not we needed to close campuses. The Department of Education established an emergency response website, and we even pretty much put a placeholder on superintendent calendars for every day at 4 o'clock to do daily briefings and updates. And we were able to continue through this process by providing updates and webinar informations and topical calls and archiving every single one of the pieces of technical assistance and conversations onto our website that we still continue to update and aggregate and put best practices and resources on. And we encourage everybody, parents, teachers, students, community members, to use that website and find the latest information and where we're at with Florida schools.
Let me ask you this. So you're, whether it be just before, just after, or during spring break, you're closing the schools down. Children that were showing up to school day in, day out are no longer going to be taught that way. What was put into place to be able to continue education throughout the rest of the year for the students in Florida?
So initially, when we were looking at extending spring break, we were very optimistic that this was a temporary ask of our districts and our educational families, and we would be able to welcome back students in a short amount of time. When it looked like spring break was going to be extended beyond that, we immediately began engaging in deeper conversations that really focused around if we had to pivot our way of learning and implement a distance learning option for our students so that we can keep our teachers connected with our students and mitigate learning loss as much as possible, what would that look like? And I distinctly remember early on when Commissioner Corcoran was having that conversation with school leaders, school superintendents across the state. Superintendent of Miami-Dade County was one of the first that chimed up and shared with everybody on the call that Miami-Dade had actually been working on developing what they refer to as instructional continuity plans. And the reason they were working on that is because they wanted to find ways to continue learning in case they had to shut down for natural disasters such as hurricanes, but felt like this template or model was applicable to what we were asking districts to develop and possibly implement, and immediately shared that resource across the state of Florida to other districts. And that spirit of collaboration and sharing best practices from peer to peer, I almost feel like began at that moment and has continued through this very single day.
So did you call it the instructional continuity plan that got rolled out across all of the schools in Florida?
So when we realized that the state of Florida was going into phase 1 through the swift, bold action of Governor DeSantis to mitigate the spread, part of that included closing school campuses. And we asked districts, and they had about 5 days to really develop, be thoughtful, and we exercise local control and as much flexibility and authority that we could give them to develop those plans and submit them to us. And then we ended up asking, moving forward, asking districts to implement those plans. And the analogy that we kind of look at is we took the light switch on education as we knew it and just turned it off in our classrooms and completely asked our school districts, our teachers, our leaders to pivot the way of learning with that face-to-face option and move into a distance learning platform, which they were able to do.
How did the distance, well, let me ask this. Obviously, the year got finished out. We had graduations without any graduates there and no proms and all of those things. But the year got finished. The academic year was over. Has there been a chance to understand whether distance learning had any impact at all, good, bad, or indifferent?
So I think that's a great question. And leading up to this response, if I may fill in a little bit more of that timeline, it became very clear when we were extending distance learning that it was going to go for longer than 2, 3, or 4 weeks. Well, during that time, our school leaders were asking Commissioner Corcoran some very, very good questions about, if we have to stay in distance learning, what does that mean for our accountability system on how we measure student performance, to speak to your question, and how do we close out the school year with grades, and how do we ensure that the instructional hours and seat time requirements and days in our calendar will be met. And I can tell you that in that conversation, Commissioner Corcoran very clearly stated that whatever obstacle, whatever challenge, whatever we can do at the state level to make sure that we protect students and hold them harmless, we will do with compassion and grace. And that mantra of compassion and grace has been echoed throughout the intimates of our building and shared across all of our school districts, and has been the mantra and mindset that we have navigated through this pandemic as we've been moving forward with continuing education here in the state of Florida.
Has there been an opportunity to evaluate how well distance learning worked out?
So anecdotally, we've heard some really good feedback from school districts, from parents, from students, and I could tell you, as a parent of 2 children, I could tell you one of my children did pretty well in distance learning and one of them did not. And everybody had a little bit different impact when we were in that learning environment. But very quickly, when we asked districts to implement the instructional continuity plans and move to distance learning, it became very apparent that access to devices and internet was a challenge. We know that we have some vulnerable populations of students that we support that are in different programs, such as special education. We support homeless students, foster students, migrant students, students that are learning language as a second language, our English language learners. And through this process, we recognized that there were some students that became disconnected from schools when they weren't open. and they were non-responsive to teacher inquiries, to administrator inquiries, and we have grave concerns about the learning loss that many of these students may have had without being able to be in a successful learning environment while we were implementing distance learning.
And were you involved in discussions directly with the superintendents trying to understand the depth and breadth of these issues?
Each and every single day. And when I tell you we established those open lines of communications, whether it was through webinars or personal phone calls and emails, we are doing everything we can to stay abreast of each school district and where they are with the implementation of distance learning, and then summer recovery programs. And then now, as we're reopening schools and planning for the fall, as the state started moving back from phase 1 to phase 2, so our campuses were resuming their normal operations as well. And as we've been engaged with school districts about mitigating loss, there's a term that is pretty familiar in education that's called the summer slide. And that's an annual challenge that many educators face when students have been out of schools for 6, 7, 8 weeks and they come back. Well, that summer slide is being compounded with a new term called the COVID slide. And the possibility of students being disconnected from a classroom or a classroom teacher for up to 12 weeks is concerning, especially for some of our most vulnerable populations. And the conversations that we've been having with school district leaders is at the very first most vulnerable population or most vulnerable student that we need to identify and start engaging them with direct instruction are students that we already knew were struggling in school. We had struggling learners in school that had access to an array of supports, but then throughout distance learning and throughout the summer have not had one connection to the school. And the research behind that has been very clear that those students stand the most to lose as far as exacerbating achievement gaps, and we need to do everything we can as soon as we can to bring those students in and mitigate and minimize that learning loss.
When did you first start having any discussions with superintendents about how, if at all, to get open this fall for the students?
Well, so in schools, most school campuses never really close. So when we were in phase 1 as a state, and that meant that our school campuses were closed, and that impacts other industries and other entities as well. The second the state moved to phase 2, minus 3 counties, there's 3 counties in South Florida that are still at phase 1. Phase 2, those conversations immediately began because schools typically don't close. They have administrators working year round. They have summer athletic programs, summer camps, early learning centers. Many of our school districts run technical centers in colleges. They're partners with our state college system. And the second we were able to move to phase 2, we've been engaged in how can we safely reopen these campuses for those students that need access to services. And many of our school districts started summer learning programs for whether it was summer reading camps, extended school year opportunities, summer youth camps and activities. And those practices have been ongoing as we are reopening schools in the fall.
So these districts went into the phase 2 in the summer actually were using their physical plants for education?
Yes, sir.
And that was all the counties except for Dade, Palm Beach, and Broward?
Well, all the districts in phase 2, their campuses are open. Whether or not each and every single school in a district has some sort of program, I don't know the answer to that, but collectively overall, there are some sort of activities happening on school campuses. And it could be maintenance that could be happening. It could be administrators preparing for the next school year. There are people that work in schools year round.
When do you recall first having discussions with superintendents about the potential for opening sticks and bricks in beginning of this year?
So conversations about resuming school activities began at the end of May. Even though the state moved for those 64 districts in the middle of May, it was decided to keep schools closed for the rest of the year because it would have been really disruptive to try to reopen for a week or 2 weeks and make sure that schools were trained and had the proper personal protective equipment. And most of our school districts typically end in the middle, end of May or the first week of June. But those conversations about resuming school activities began in May. Many of our schools were calling us and asking us questions about whether or not they could have graduation. That was a big deal to a lot of our high school seniors and to a lot of our school administrators and to a lot of educational families. There are certain rites of passage that students look forward to. And districts were very creative in finding ways to, whether they opened up their campuses outside in football stadiums or doing it through virtual presence or finding alternative platforms to resume those educational activities and experiences.
Thank you. How was it that, well, you're familiar with Emergency Order 6 that brings us here, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
How did that come about?
So in the summer, as school districts start planning and building out budgets and staffing for the upcoming year, we were doing some parent survey data in conjunction with many districts that were doing parent survey data. And we started seeing some consistent trends for families in, let's say, the end of May, beginning of June. The survey results were coming up almost in that rule of thirds when we were asking parents what kind of learning option did they want for their child. And early on, about a third of our parents said that come fall, come August, we want to send our children back to school, a traditional brick and mortar face-to-face experience. They want a classroom teacher and a seat on a roster for their child. About a third of our families said that they were not comfortable sending their children back and desired, whether it was a virtual school program or a distance learning program or maybe even a homeschool program, they weren't ready to send their children back when it came back to schools reopening in August. And then about a third of our families were undecided. So as we began engaging in conversations with districts over the summer, and the legislature starts passing budgets and school districts start receiving their projected enrollment, it became very clear from school superintendents and school finance directors that the way our current statutes are written and the way that seat time is captured in schools in Florida, that if there wasn't some flexibility in innovative opportunities in 10, 20, 30% of our families want an alternative option, if we weren't able to provide that, that could have a significant impact on their revenue.
And how so?
Well, in the state of Florida, students are basically forecasted in enrollment. And the funding models, they get very complex. It's called the Florida Education Finance Program. But there's two traditional ways that students get funded for in the state of Florida. One is through a virtual school model. And typically that means a student withdraws from their local school or maybe even their local district and enrolls in a virtual program, like say the Florida Virtual School, or many school districts have a virtual franchise. Well, those students get funded based on court completion, and it's not a set amount of hours. And that is a work at your own pace environment. And that is something that many students in the state of Florida have great success in. But there's also many students in the state of Florida that do not have great success in that program as well. Well, the other way that students generate funding and meet instructional hour requirements is through seat time. And basically that's face-to-face learning experience. And those students basically twice a year in something that we call survey get captured, and that happens in October and it happens in February, and that is based on the students that are present in class in the different courses that they're enrolled in, is how the schools and school districts would get funded for those students. Districts knew that if they weren't able to open their schools and count students that wanted that face-to-face seat time experience and learning remotely or in a distant environment, they would not get credit for those students unless we were able to provide some flexibility for them. So that's really the early conversations around this emergency order was a direct result from the requests of finance directors and superintendents asking us to provide their families the flexible options that they are desiring in ways that we can help support and meet them.
Let me have put up exhibit 3. A June 29, 2020 letter from Miami-Dade County Public Schools to the Honorable Richard Corcoran. Are you familiar with this letter?
Yes, sir.
And is this what you were talking about, this request for help and consideration and trying to make these options available to parents that were not face-to-face, but rather some form of e-learning?
That's correct. There's a initialism in there called FTE, which stands for full-time equivalent. And the consensus of that letter is they wouldn't get credit for a full-time student if they weren't able to bring that student in the class during that survey window, even though the school and the teachers are working with that student, because that student is learning remotely, we needed to put into place some flexible options for those school districts. And that's basically what this letter is referring to and asking for that flexibility.
I think if you look in the first paragraph, it says that they've done a survey and there are some parents that want their children to come, but there are many that are uncomfortable, so that there would be a situation where you have some students there, but many perhaps attending by e-learning.
Some refer to it as e-learning, or we call it distance learning. And that's when we put forth the emergency order and we developed what we're referring to as an assurance template that districts submitted on how they're going to meet the assurances of the emergency order. And in their reopening plan, we asked them to identify how they're going to provide this learning space. And when we did that, we 100% wanted those decisions to be done locally with the teachers and leaders and experts in their school district, and determining whether that was going to be done in a synchronous environment, an asynchronous environment. How are they going to curriculum map? How are they going to make sure the students that want a seat on a teacher's roster held for them, but don't want to take that seat until they're comfortable, make sure that we can maintain instructional continuity with them in a remote setting.
The concept of the emergency order was to provide more flexibility for the parents and the superintendents.
That's correct. And basically what the emergency order did is, because what districts were really asking is, we have a projected student count. We don't know how many students are going to come to school, but we need to build a system and staff that system as if every student is going to come to school. They may not come in August, they may not come in October, but they may come in January, they may come in February. If we can't have some assurances to protect our funding so that we can staff to what we're projected of students to have, that could be problematic. So this emergency order gave those districts the assurance that they would get funded to the level that they were projected. And the reason that's really important is because that survey data does get recalibrated, and superintendents and school districts are used to this. We get a projection. A projection is a projection. We believe you're going to have this many students, and we believe you're going to generate this much money in FTE, that full-time equivalency. Well, after those snapshots of data, those projections turn into actual deliverables. And districts were very worried that if 10, 20, 30, 40, 50% of families aren't comfortable sending their students back, when they would get recalibrated, say in January of the school year, it could be detrimental to their budget and staffing formulas. And basically, in response to the request from districts, we were able to put some hold harmless language in place so that districts can plan accordingly and move forward with providing that full school experience.
Well, let me stop you there and talk about that timing for a moment. You said that census is done in October and February. So for the 2019, 2020 year, that would have been October of 19 and February of 20.
That's correct.
So the censuses for the 2019, 2020 year would have been in the books before the closure for coronavirus.
That's correct. And that was a big deal to school district leaders as well. And I go back to Commissioner Corcoran's stance on compassion and grace when we were making distance learning decisions in March. He put in and requested and got the support of the governor some language to give districts that flexibility with seat time requirements and assured them that their funding would not be recalibrated because that snapshot had already happened. The budget was already set forth and allocated, and we were not going to reappropriate that.
Now, for the school year that we're in now, the budgeting is going to be based on what happens in October of this year and February of next year?
Well, the districts receive a projected forecast. Say I'm in school district A, it may say we project you to have 20,000 students, and according to your base student allocation, your budget will be $200 million. I'm just using round numbers. Well, without this emergency order, when we would get to that survey in October, that would have been recalibrated on the number of students that have completed courses in virtual or the number of students that actually showed up and participated during in that teacher's class during that FaceTime instruction. Anybody that decided to do distance learning or learn remotely would not have been captured in that data.
And that would have incented the superintendents not to make these extra options available?
Well, the superintendents were requesting that these options be available because we've got many families, and I talk to families every day and stay engaged with school districts where they want their child to be in their home zone school, their neighborhood school, to be part of that elementary school that they started kindergarten in. They want to be in that fourth grade teacher. They want a seat on that teacher's roster. They don't want to withdraw from that school and enroll in Florida Virtual School or a virtual learning program of the sorts. They want a teacher in that school, and they want to stay connected to that school, but they want to send their child to that school when they're comfortable and ready to do that. So a lot of families are saying, we want a remote option. We don't want to enroll in a virtual program that's a learn at your own pace. We want directed instruction. We want a connection to a teacher in our school, and we want to be able to provide that flexibility. And this is what we were able to do throughout that emergency order.
Let me put that up for a moment and we'll ask some questions. I'm not going to leave it up there too terribly long. Whoa, okay. So you're familiar with this emergency order?
Yes, sir.
And the whereas clauses to this emergency order?
Yes, sir.
Let me ask you about, see if I can read this. Oh, thank you. In the fourth whereas clause, whereas there's a need to open schools fully to ensure the quality and continuity of the educational process, the comprehensive well-being of students and families, and a return to Florida hitting its full economic stride. What does that mean? What's being said?
Well, schools do more than just educate students, and schools are a place where we provide educational supports, primarily, but it's also a place where students get connected to their peer groups and their social emotional needs are being met. But we also have many students that rely on schools as a place to receive food, a place of belonging, a place of safety. And in fact, there are some schools that are full comprehensive schools that provide medical care for not just the students, but for the family. And especially in our neighborhood schools, they're a hub of that community, and where parents and community members go to get latest information and stay connected. And we know that schools are a big part of not just our children's life, but the sustainability and growth of our communities. And we need high quality educational systems that support with local business and industry needs to make sure that when our students leave us in K-12, they're ready to transition for success and post-secondary outcomes, or have the credentials necessary for them to support their local community industry. And if we're not able to open schools and provide that safety network, it could have devastating impacts on the local community and their needs.
Mr. Hill, let's go to the next page. Gosh, I know how to do it. Keep going. All the way down to reopening. Next, keep going. Keep going. Yeah, keep going. I want to, no, stop. Look at section D, disability, students with disabilities in English language. Why is this in the order?
Well, one of the things that we know as we implemented distance learning, and we were hearing from families and schools and teachers and leaders, there was concerns that we may not be providing a full access and array of services, especially to some of our most vulnerable populations. So a lot of times our students with disabilities rely on related services that's identified in their individualized education plan. And those services could mean occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech and language therapy, some additional layers of support that may not transition into a distance learning environment. And those students, both state and federally, have a safety umbrella around making sure their needs are being met, which is referred to as FAPE, and that stands for a free and appropriate public education. And we knew we were responding to a pandemic and a crisis, and put some short-term conditions in place to support learning and continuity the best that we can. But moving long-term, as we start planning for an entire school year, we need to take those considerations on whether or not students do have access to a free and appropriate public education. And if we can't fully implement these individualized education plans and give the related services to our students who need them the most, regression may happen, and it may be significant. Our English language learners, especially if English isn't being spoken at home, rely on a full language immersion program where they need access to educators and peer groups to help support their transition into learning English. And a lot of times that may start with listening and speaking, and students may be able to do that with some levels of support in a distant environment. But as they transition to reading and writing, typically those students need more interaction, more directed support, and need to be around other speakers of English in order to help support and make that transition.
Let me move up to section C. You talked about this concept of progress. Why was section C on progress monitoring put into this emergency order?
So as we implemented distance learning in March and knew that we were going to stay in that model for the rest of the year, the decision was made, and it was the right decision, to sunset what we refer to as our accountability program. And in the state of Florida, students in 3 through 8th grade take various assessments in English language arts and math. We also have end of course exams in algebra and biology, and in ways that we kind of take an annual checkup or an annual snapshot on our students to make sure they're learning what we expect them to learn and achieving the level of growth that we want to see. Well, when we implemented distance learning and it transitioned to a long-time impact, we were not able to administrate those assessments. And oftentimes those assessments are tools that become very valuable to school administrators as they're looking at placing students in coursework for the following year, or even determining which type of professional development their teachers and leaders may need for support. So we know that the impact of that COVID slide and summer slide that we're talking about could be great. And when students start transitioning back to school, we want a robust baseline progress monitoring system so we can get a snapshot of how students are. And it's like an annual checkup, and it's an evaluative piece of information that we can use to assess, diagnose, and prescribe where the students are and meet them where their needs are, and make sure that we can mitigate learning loss and get them as up to grade level, if not accelerate and beyond, as soon as possible.
Thank you. Let's go to page 2, please, Mr. Hill. Okay. Go to section 1, reopening requirements, section A, all schools opening, much of why we are here. The document says, upon reopening in August, all school boards and charter school governing boards must open brick and mortar schools at least 5 days per week for all students, subject to advice and orders of the Florida Department of Health, local departments of health, Executive Order 2149, and subsequent executive orders. Why this requirement? Why is this statement about reopening in August brick and mortar?
Well, Florida statute has a date, a calendar date that says no schools or school districts can start school before August 10th. And let's say COVID or non-pandemic aside, the majority of school districts each year will start their school calendar around that time on August 10th. The latest that we have typically seen was about August 24th. Going into this year, there's districts that have delayed that. But the reason we start school in August is because we also have some requirements that say schools need to be open for 180 days, or the equivalent of 900 instructional hours for grades 4 through 12, which is how we build out a school calendar. Ideally, you want your first semester, if you break that down into weeks, you have 2 9-week periods, 18 weeks, and we call that a term, to end at winter break. And then the second term would begin in January and end sometime in May or June. If we don't set an instructional calendar that meets that 180 days of instruction, or the equivalent of 900 hours, and keep pushing that back and push that back into September, October, then now we're getting into June and July, which takes away planning for the upcoming year. And if we get past July, we start crossing fiscal years. So we ask districts to continue with those plans, which they do each and every year, to develop a calendar that meets their needs best. But starts in August so that we can get those instructional hours and requirements and opportunities for students to learn in those semester breaks. That is what districts want and typically submit to us each and every single year.
Thank you. That tells us all why August, but why does it say must, M-U-S-T, must open brick and mortar schools at least 5 days per week for all students?
So one, we've got parents that are asking for this and almost demanding this of us. And two, we know that distance learning may not have worked for everyone. And when we look at vulnerable populations and we look at the schools are pretty much open year round, we want to look at ways that we can start identifying groups of students that need to be prioritized and brought into campus and given the high quality instruction that they need. And on top of that, we often talk about mitigating learning loss, but we also have students that need opportunities to excel. And we have students that are in high-level engaging programs that it's really hard to replicate their learning environment and needs in distance learning. We have students that need access to a chemistry lab. It's really hard to reproduce some of our art programs or our career and technical education programs. And even in the summer, reopening schools in fall aside, there was a sense of urgency around students that were in nursing programs, construction programs that needed to be in a face-to-face environment to continue their education. And we were able to do that. And we want to continue to do that and make sure that our campuses are open and start receiving students.
Well, let me stop you there. You knew on July 6th when this went out that COVID-19 had not disappeared in the state of Florida, didn't you?
Yes.
You knew it was still an issue and still a concern around schools reopening, didn't you?
Yes.
Okay, and in fact, here it says must be open and goes on subject to advice and orders of the Florida Department of Health, local departments of health, executive order, and subsequent executive orders. Put that aside for a moment. I've read this more times than I care. There's nothing in here that talks to the school superintendents about safe ways to open schools. There's no checklist or anything else in this document, is there?
In the emergency order?
Correct.
No, that's not one of the assurances outlined in the emergency order.
And you don't provide that information in the emergency order either, do you?
No.
We'll come back to the emergency order. Would you put up Exhibit 2, please? Okay, Mr. Oliva, are you familiar with Exhibit 2 called Reopening Florida's Schools and the CARES Act?
Yes, sir.
What involvement did you have, if any, in the production of this document?
So this was a collaborative project between several members of the Division of Public Schools as well as our senior leadership team.
What other groups contributed to this?
Well, internally, as far as the Department of Education employees, or
Total. I mean, was there any external groups that contributed to this and participated in this?
yes, but before we published this document, we shared this document with what we refer to as relevant stakeholder groups, commonly known as school superintendents. We shared it with district leaders. We shared it with other state agencies. We shared it. In fact, I believe there's a page at the end that lists all the organizations that contributed to the collaboration of this, but it would be multiple different organizations across many different platforms.
Did it include the Florida Education Association?
Part of the review and the development of this document was direct input from the Florida Education Association's task force, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, let's turn, Mr. Hill, if you would, please, to page 35. And I promise we're not going through 170 pages. Page 35, Part 2, Guidance for Reopening Healthy Learning Environments. Are you familiar with this? I don't know, it's another 35 or 40 pages in this section.
Yes, sir.
What was the purpose of providing this?
So this document isn't a one-stop shop for everything, but it's a tool where we were able to aggregate the latest best practices in research and resources and collect all that and put into one document, not to be in a prescriptive manner, but to be in a supportive manner for school districts to start outlining the conversations that they needed to have locally when developing their reopening plan. So this is a supportive tool that districts asked us for. In fact, it was very well received, as well as in this tool, it outlines the dollars that school districts would be receiving in federal support as they're developing those plans. But there's some very clear statements in this document that school districts were able to use in developing their reopening plans that they eventually ended up submitting to us here at the department.
So how does this this work on this page? Is this supposed to be like going around a clock, or are these just 5 different points?
Well, they all intersect. So it's really to set a vision that if we're able to achieve all 5 of these talking points into one plan, then we should be in a pretty comprehensive place when we're looking at the implementation of that plan.
There's a thing here. It says dimmer switch, step-by-step approach. You talked earlier when the schools were closed in March about taking that light switch and flipping it off. What are we talking about here with the dimmer switch?
So that's one of the analogies that we've been using, and we often refer to when we're providing support for our districts and on our classrooms as we knew it. And when we started engaging in conversations about reopening, we knew from day one, we're not just going to flip the switch back on and everything's going to be back the way it was. We knew we needed to change that switch and put in a dimmer switch. And really the mindset is how can we start identifying in a safe and efficient manner small pockets of students and gradually scale up those services that we were able to provide to our students before we moved to distance learning in March. It's a gradual and methodical approach, which is why it states very clearly that these decisions are going to be made at the local level, working with the local administrators and school leaders in their community that know their school buildings, that know their students, and their local health experts that know the same amount of information for the development of these plans as they do gradually turn the dimmer switch back on into our classrooms.
Dr. Hopes from Manatee County was on before you and talked about working with the Department of Health, working with the community teachers, his union. Is that what you're talking about here, establishing supports and partnerships in communities to make local decisions?
That's it. And these decisions are not easy to make sometimes. And the more relevant input that you can get in making decisions, the better, or more oftentimes you're going to come in a better landing place. But what I can tell you was very clear from our school districts when they were asking us to give them some documents and some talking points and framework was they did not want a one-size-fits-all approach or mandate from the state. And that became an ongoing theme as we were developing recommendations and best practices, because they wanted to have local decision making. The needs of schools and students in Lafayette County is very different than Collier County, which is very different than Putnam County or even Palm Beach County. And we were very deliberate in that mindset to make sure we didn't do a one-size-fits-all mandate and be very respectful of local decision making from day one.
And how does that relate to the 12 o'clock statement here, reopening is a locally driven decision?
I think that just reinforces the fact we've got elected officials, elected school board members, school superintendents, and district leaders. And when it comes down to developing and implementing their calendars, their curriculum, their innovative learning models, their scheduling and staffing for schools, we want to give them the full authority and autonomy to make that down at the local level.
Okay, let's go to, if you would, while we're still on this document, page 51. I'm only going to do a couple of these just to get an idea. What are we seeing here versus recommendations to redesign the school day to reduce risks, sir?
So this goes back to just some best practices and ideas to share. When we were asking schools to think about how schools were going to reopen in fall, we wanted to give them ideas of what we've seen at other schools' plans, other states' plans, national best practices, guidelines, but just things to consider as you're developing these plans. We're not going to put a one-size-fits-all mandate that says every classroom must look at this. But these are things that we've seen on a national landscape that looked promising and wanted to share that and provide that as a resource for districts to know that some of these best practices have been implemented in other schools and other districts, and they may want to consider that as well.
We go to page 52, and then I think we'll be done with this. Recommendations to communicate transparently and frequently. What was the idea behind these suggestion points?
Well, it's about being transparent, and when you open up schools or you have possibility of exposure, we're encouraging districts to, and they are working with their local Department of Health and contact tracing, but to be transparent and share what's happening on school campuses, be upfront and honest on the way they're going to keep their educational families safe. And when we say educational family, we're talking about teachers, leaders, bus drivers, support staff, students, and engage them in the process. It shouldn't be done in isolation. And when you're developing these plans, to listen to all different perspectives and points of view. And if we can do that in a collaborative manner, we'll have a better product in the end.
I'm not going to pull it out in this, but does this, you said the document also talked about the CARES Act. What did that have to do, and why were you can take it down? Why were you discussing the CARES Act in connection with providing resources to these superintendents and school districts around reopening?
So the state of Florida received some, and it's called the CARES dollars from the federal level, and we were able to, through different programs, provide additional dollars to school districts for COVID-related expenses. And part of that grant was we refer to it as an entitlement grant. Basically, every district gets a certain allotment based on the number of students they have in that district. And about $700 million throughout the state of Florida was directly given to school districts. In fact, we were able to roll out those assurances grants and deploy those dollars in a fast and efficient manner. But those are dollars that districts can use for COVID-related expenses, buying personal protective equipment, professional development. They had pretty full flexibility as long as it was a COVID-related expense to use those dollars as they saw fit.
Let me bring up, if you would, Mr. Hill, exhibit number 3. Are you familiar with this document?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and does this lay out the allocation? Go to the bottom of the second page, Mr. Hill, please. $693,223 and 61. 693,200 million. I'm sorry. I got to go back to public school. 693,000 million, rather, $223,066 that were allocated. And those went out directly to the school districts?
Correct.
So, for example, just scroll back up on that page. You should be able to find Orange County. There's the O's, right? Orange County, $55 million.
Correct. And I think it's important to note that would include dollars for their public charter schools. And then there's a term called equitable services for the private schools as well. But for the Orange County School District and associated educational agencies within their district, their allocation was about $55 million.
And then you see Miami-Dade County, $119 million.
Correct.
Okay. Now, in addition, have materials like protective equipment been made available to the districts?
So the Emergency Operation Center had some dollars available, and I know they were responsible for providing to school districts masks. They had a formula that looked at, I think it was the number of teachers, the number of students, but there was a methodology that they were able to allocate at the state level and divvy up some resources to school districts as well.
Now, let me go back, Mr. Hill, to the emergency order. And go to page 6. Roman numeral 3 is called reporting flexibility and financial continuity, and says school districts and charter school governing boards with an approved reopening plan will receive reporting flexibility that's designed to provide financial continuity for the 2020 fall semester. How did that work?
So this goes back to that conversation that school districts typically, after the legislature finishes and the governor signs the budget, get an allocation that happens in July that says that they're projected to have a certain number of students, and these are the dollars that are associated with those students for planning purposes. And that's how they build their staffing formulas. That's how they build their budget. That's how they design programs and plan accordingly for the upcoming school year. Well, those dollars include making sure those students come to school and have access to the services that are outlined in the budget that is appropriated. When we looked at this emergency order, this is exactly referring to the protection that districts wanted, because they knew in October there may be 10, 20, 30, 40% of families not sending their kid to school in the manner that they typically would have. Without this protection, they would not have been able to count those students in their class. So this tells the districts that if you submit a reopening plan and it's approved and you implement it, we're going to hold you harmless and not recalibrate you based on the data we receive in October, but give you the amount of funding that you are projected based on the enrollment that was associated with your projection.
Okay, come back to that again in a minute. If you'll just go up to the last sentence immediately above Roman numeral 3, sir, and highlight it for me. It says, nothing herein requires a district or charter school to submit a plan if the district or charter school wishes to open in traditional compliance with statutory requirements for instructional days and hours. That's what it says, doesn't it, Mr. Oliva?
Yes, sir.
Now, so if I'm a school district, I don't have to submit one of these plans, but correct me if I'm wrong. If I don't get an approved plan, then when I open, I'm going to get funding in accordance with the statute. So if I've got children in the seats, I get funded for that. But if I open up with a large number of e-learning, I will only be paid the way the e-learning people get paid.
That's correct. Districts could choose to not submit the assurances in the reopening plan. In fact, some of our districts say that they feel pretty strongly that the majority of their families are going to continue sending their children to school in the manner that they've always sent them. So they're going to move forward with the way they've always counted their student count and meet the instructional hour requirements and calendar requirements that they would have done each and every single year.
Let me ask you this, though. Let's just get it right out on the table here. Doesn't the requirement to have an approved plan to get the flexible funding give you an awful lot of incentive to get a approved plan?
Yes.
So if I'm a school district and I think I'm going to have 60 or 70% of my students showing up virtually, whether it be virtual through the classroom or through the virtual high school, then my choice is either to submit one of these plans and get it approved or take a very big haircut. Isn't that true?
Well, if you submit this plan and get it approved, you'll be held harmless to that October account. So you would have a guarantee of funding. So yes, we would encourage districts to submit a plan.
Mr. Oliva, let's not use fancy terms like hold harmless. It's a bunch of money that you don't get if you don't get the approved plan, isn't it?
Potentially, yes, based on who comes to school in October.
Okay. And so if you really only have 30% of your people come to school in October, then you're getting an awful lot less money.
Significant.
So doesn't this force schools to open when they don't really think they should, when it's not really safe?
Well, I think that's why in Assurance 1, in the first bullet, it refers back to we have to have a plan to reopen our schools 5 days a week. But ultimately, there's local decisions by the school leaders, superintendents, school boards about welcoming those students as long as it's done in consultation with local health experts.
Okay. Well, let's talk about that. We'll take the easy part first. Has Dade County got an approved plan?
Yes.
Have they opened up, or are they opening it up in August, bricks and mortars?
No, in fact, they're starting school. I believe it. I don't remember the dates of every plan, but I want to say it's around August 31st with distance learning, and are evaluating local conditions with the hope to bring students back sooner, but they're projecting right now around a mid-October reopening date.
And Broward County also is not going to be opening bricks and mortar in August?
That's correct.
And they have an approved plan?
That's correct. Now, I will say that in collaboration and consultation with the leaders of both those districts mentioned, they are going to find ways, even though we considered phase 1, find ways to see if they can identify classes for their most vulnerable students to be able to come in and receive services in their schools when they can accommodate those requests.
Then why, when Hillsborough County requested to move its face-to-face opening, I think 3 weeks into September, did the commissioner see fit to write back a letter saying that that was not appropriate under their plan?
So Hillsborough County had submitted a reopening plan that met the 5 or 7 assurances, depending on the template that filled out, that said that they were going to have their schools open in a brick and mortar environment by August and be able to receive students. Well, that plan was approved, and it was even posted on our website, and then their board took action to delay the implementation of that plan by not receiving students for up to 4 weeks. And the concern is that you have drastically deviated from your plan. And the questions and dialogues were, are you going to resubmit a plan, or are you going to ask for additional waivers? Or where the commissioner landed is, can you provide us some additional details and information of why you're not able to open any of your campuses, and basically taking 120 hours of instruction and turning it into a distant environment?
Let's pull up Exhibit 10. Can you make that bigger? Please, sir. Okay. This has been up a couple times already. Are you familiar with this letter to Superintendent Davis and Chair Snidely?
Yes, sir.
Can we go over to the next page? Well, wait a minute. Let's stop at the first page and highlight the first couple, the first 2 sentences. Or the whole paragraph. It's fine. No, the second paragraph, please. Says this blanket district-wide decision directly contradicts the district's reopening plan, which was approved because it was consistent with the framework of Emergency Order 2020, and the order seeks to empower parents with the ability to choose the education modality best for their child's need. Why make the distinction that this was a district-wide decision? What's the significance to you of that?
So when we look at the content of the emergency order, it refers to schools and school closures in a case-by-case singular event. And when the decision was made to shutter every campus or quarantine every campus, I don't know exactly how many schools that Hillsborough has, but I'm sure it's well over 200 or 250 campuses. The questions that we have is, what was the rationale or reasoning behind saying every one of these campuses now must close? And we asked the district, based on that district-wide decision, to provide us some more evidence or answer some questions. And some of our basic questions that we had with the district is, well, are these schools open now? Do you have staff working in these buildings and on these school campuses now? And now are you sending them home saying it's not safe to come back to work and continue with that planning? And when we have schools that many of our schools in the state of Florida may cover 5 to 10 acres under roof on some of our big campuses, we get that you might not be able to reopen a high school to 2,500 students, but can you open it to 10% of your students and identify some of those student populations and bring them out and properly meet CDC recommendations and best practices to keep them safe? So that questions, or the questions in this letter was, if you're going to make a district-wide decision, can you provide us some more information and details on why every school campus must be shut and why none of them can be open at all, even if it's only to a handful of students?
Okay. Yeah, that next. Okay. Okay. What's the number?
21.
That's the one we marked. We'll pull up exhibit 21, please. Okay, you're gonna scroll down. We saw this exhibit yesterday, I believe, with the one of the school board members from Hillsborough County, Mr. Oliva. Are you familiar with these proposals that came back from the superintendent in response to the letter?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And as you can see, they have made a proposal to, blind here, in both of these, to open up to some very specialized groups. For example, specialized learning centers, homeless students, migrant students, and the like. And if we'll scroll back up, we'll see what the response was. A little bit further down so I can see who signed it. Do you know who Eric Hall is?
Yes, sir. He's our senior chancellor.
Okay. Are you all in the same group? Does he report to you? How does that work?
I report to him.
Oh, okay. Don't tell him I said the other then. As you can see, he's not apparently happy with the letter coming back and says it's unclear whether proposals 1 and 2 are consistent with EO6 based on the details. If you wish to proceed with either of these, they want a school by school analysis along with an amended plan. Why do you want that school by school analysis on what they're able to get back? Why not just say, well, you told me you're going to do the bottom 300 and migrant workers, and I forget what the other one was. Why isn't that enough?
So this goes back to that dimmer switch approach, and we know we want to support districts as they gradually reopen their campuses. And while proposals 1 and 2 start to do that by identifying vulnerable populations, start to look at our struggling schools and our special needs centers, our follow-up with questions was, okay, if that's say 100 of your 250 schools, is there anything, what are you doing at the other 150 schools? And if it's not safe to open them, or it's the conditions aren't right, or maybe you can bring in a small group of students, we want to know what that plan is as well.
11. Now, has the superintendent gotten back with you yet on a breakdown as to how they might be able to spread some students across the 230 some odd schools, 260, I'm sorry, schools they have in Hillsborough County?
He did not provide that breakdown, but he made the decision to reopen their campuses as what was consistent with their previously approved plan. They did ask for flexibility in reopening dates to be able to start with distance learning, but they plan on opening their school campuses on August 31st, which is in line with the assurances that they had submitted previously.
You have exhibit number 11, please. Now, did Monroe County also make a decision? Isn't it true Monroe County decided that they wanted to push into September because, as anybody that's ever been down there knows, August is lobster season and there's lots of tourists down there, and they were concerned about being open?
Yeah, so in July, Monroe County is another school district that had submitted a reopening plan, and even in their reopening plan identified conditions such as a high community spread and an according plan on how they would implement distance learning if they were to determine to be in that area of need. And I want to say it was in July, probably about the second week of July, their school board, working with their local Department of Health, identified Monroe County as a high community spread, and the data supported that. They were definitely trending in the wrong direction. Maybe it was summer tourism season. I'm not really sure why that was relevant. And the board decided at that time to implement distance learning for the first 4 weeks of school. So we asked Monroe County, consistently with the way we asked Hillsborough County, says, okay, well, you've done everything you said you were going to do. Is there any way that you could open any part of your campus to any amount of students prior to September 15th? And we know you're going to make these local decisions and look at data collectively and provide back some of that similar data. We asked Monroe to submit that as well.
Is Monroe County working with you on doing that?
So I'm in contact with school superintendents daily, and talked with Monroe County about their reopening plans, and they have continued to look at local data and look at the advice of their local Department of Health, who has informed them that the conditions actually improved to what they were hoping to see before schools reopened. And they are going to go to their school board next week, I believe on the 25th, on Tuesday, and submit a proposal to go ahead and reopen their campuses as they had previously planned, because the community spread has diminished to their acceptable levels, and will have their campuses open to students.
So have there been plans submitted, reviewed, and accepted?
As far as district reopening plans?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry, that wasn't a very good question. Yes.
Yes, I believe the deadline was July 31st for districts to submit a reopening plan, and we've reviewed each and every single reopening plan, and we actually prioritized them based on reopening dates for how we went through the review process. And our mindset from day one in our communication with districts is we're going to get every plan approvable or to an approvable level, because that's what we want to do. We want to protect our schools and our school districts and give them the resources that are allotted for them. And to date, I believe we're at 65 approved plans, and every one of our approved plans are on our website, which anybody can read and access. And I've actually haven't been down in my office for the last couple hours, but I believe we're going to have the rest of them reviewed today and finalized. And I would like to note that every plan was approved well before their reopening date, so that nobody was in limbo with implementing a reopening plan without getting it to an approval status.
And you have a team that reviews these plans?
Yeah, if you look at the different assurances, there's some kind of content area experts in some of those lenses. Excuse me. So when we look at the assurance of how we're going to support English language learners, our bureau chief over the English language bureau reviewed each and every single one of those plans. When we looked at the special education sections, our bureau chiefs for special educations reviewed all those plans, because we wanted to make sure it was comprehensive and we weren't denying anybody for access to a free and appropriate public education. And There was a handful of us that looked at the different assurances, and we collaborated together on the feedback that we saw and gave back to the districts and engaged in that dialogue. And it's been a pretty seamless process.
Your Honor, I'm close to being done, but would appreciate a break indulgence if we could do that.
All right, let's take a 10-minute recess.
Thank you.
Just for 10 minutes.
Todd.
Okay, Mr. Wells, you may continue with the direct on Mr. Oliva.
Okay, back. Can you put up for me, please, sir, Exhibit 7A, the Leon County Schools Plan? We're going to put up a document here in a second. So, Mr. Oliva, you indicated that many of these plans have been reviewed and approved. Is Leon County's one of them?
Yes, to my knowledge.
Okay, I'd like to go, if you would, Mr. Hill, to the page Leon County 2021 reopening plan, and then we're going to go over a couple pages from that. Bear with us, this is not the most facile one. So there's an attachment called Leon County Schools 2021 plan. Go to page 9, please. Oh, got me going dizzy. There's a section that goes on here, several pages, which lays out the Leon County plan for how to deal with the physical environment, facility cleaning, furniture and supplies, social distance practices, masks, what else? Mail delivery, campus visitors, what to do before school, arrival and dismissal, physical layout of the classrooms, what to do for lunch and breakfast. Now, these safety plans that are submitted when they're done as part of this, do you have folks that look at them as well?
Well, we review them. It's not part of the assurances that we check off to make sure they have been met. But we do have folks that have reviewed them and in some incidences have offered some suggestions or guidance. But those sections of the plan are really for the school district to develop and implement on their own.
In terms of compliance with the Emergency Order 6 and the submission of these reopening plans, why do you see it as a responsibility of the Department of Education to make sure they're done and they're compliant?
Can you repeat what Assurance 6 is?
Assurance.
Did you say for Assurance 6?
No. I'm sorry. Let me redo. No, I did not.
Okay, I misunderstood the question.
Okay, I said, as the Department of Education, why do you see it as your obligation to ensure that the districts have complied with Emergency Order 6 and submitted complying plans?
Well, if a district chooses to submit the assurances associated with Emergency Order 6, then we know that the conditions have been met to make sure that students that are learning in a distant environment will receive a high quality education, and that students that are afforded extra layers of support, those layers and safety nets are provided for those assurances, and then we're able to meet the conditions around funding and waiver of seat time. And as part of the State Board of Education and the educational system in the state of Florida, part of our role and responsibility is oversight and compliance.
Supervising the school districts in their compliance?
Yes, sir. For state and federal compliance.
Thank you. Let me wrap up with this. How many schools have opened since August 10th when it first got started?
Well, I don't know the exact number of campuses, but I believe as of yesterday, it was around 22. And today, I believe around 28 school districts have been opened across the state of Florida. And I know there's several more slated to open. August 24th is a big day. It seemed like August 10th, August 17th, and August 24th were the 3 primary dates that schools were reopening. And then there's some school districts opening in between those. And we do have a handful opening on the 31st.
Do you know how many students have returned?
If I had to guess, I'd say approximately about 150,000 students in the state of Florida.
And have some students chosen or parents chosen to have their students come in remotely as well?
Oh, yes. The 150,000 number I referred to are students that have participated in face-to-face on-site learning. There's there's several districts that have started school in a distant environment. And that is continuing. I believe Broward started yesterday. I know Orange County started on the 10th. So those schools' calendar has begun, but the face-to-face experience of that school calendar has not. The 28 or so districts that I'm referring to are the ones that have been receiving student brick and mortar face-to-face environment.
Okay, thank you. I don't have any further questions, Your Honor.
Cross.
Sorry, I missed
Yes,
the
Your
last-
Honor. Kendall Coffee.
Hang on just one second, Mr. Coffey.
Oh, yes, sir.
Madam Court Reporter. Yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, Judge. I missed the last part of his answer. It cut out a little bit. I have the 28 or so districts that I'm referring to are the ones that have been.
Oh, I think he said opened to brick and mortar. Is that correct?
Yeah, those are districts that have begun face-to-face, or their campuses are reopened and students are in those schools in the brick and mortar setting.
Thank you. I still have no more questions.
Okay, Mr. Coffey.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Mr. Oliva, and thank you for being here today. I got questions, and I'll admit that it may seem like it skips around a little bit, but you've covered a fair bit with Mr. Wells, and there's some things I want to ask about. One of the things I wanted to be clear on is with respect to certain district plans that have been approved that extend into, for example, September. We've got, what, 3 or 4 of those? Is it Miami-Dade, Broward, Monroe, and is Palm Beach in that category?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And do those school districts also have a school-by-school statistical analysis of COVID risk? School by school?
So Monroe County was asked to submit that. They have not submitted that report as of yet because they are going back to their school board to revisit the distance learning option that they have notified us that they wanted to implement. And we're still in collaboration with them, but for right now, they intend to reopen their campuses on August 31st. But Palm Beach, Broward, and Dade have not submitted the school by school report because those districts are still under phase 1 of the executive order, which includes closures of school campuses.
Okay. And have any of the districts gone school by school, grade by grade, classroom by classroom to thoughtfully determine how parents that desire in-person instruction can be accomplished? Have any of the schools gone into that kind of granular detail, sir?
That's not data that we've collected, but in conversations that I've had with school leaders, I can tell you I know of a school district where the principal called, every principal at every school called every single family and had a personal conversation with them about what they wanted for their child in the fall.
Okay. I mean, that's anecdotal, but in terms of plan submissions, none of the districts have done what you have basically told Hillsborough they had to do to get an extra 4 weeks to open safely, correct?
Right.
Okay. And I want to go back to your testimony where you said ultimately it's a local decision as long as it's done in consultation with local health experts. I wrote those notes down. You said that, didn't you?
Yes.
And what Hillsborough did, and I think you're aware of this, is they convened a special meeting and they consulted with local health experts. I think they had 6 or 7. You're aware of that, right?
Yes.
And you know that 5 of them said it's absolutely not safe. You're aware of that, correct?
Correct.
And a 6 said it's not safe today, but it might be soon, might be safe soon. Right? You remember that?
Yes.
And the local health department official refused to give an opinion or recommendation on whether it's safe to reopen. You recall that?
Sure. Yes.
And was it intended in the structure of the order that local health departments would refuse to give opinions and or recommendations as to whether it was safe to reopen. Was that intended by the emergency order?
I don't believe so.
Okay, but you're aware of the fact that local health departments have categorically said that they are not going to weigh in on the determinations of whether it's safe or unsafe to open. You're aware of that?
I've heard that, yes.
Okay. Have you called them out? Have you or the Commissioner of Education called them out and said, you folks are missing in action. These school districts need exactly that input from you. Have you called them out on it?
Well, I know Commissioner Corcoran has been in consultation with the Surgeon General. Even I know they were talking yesterday and probably today, so yes.
Okay, and in fact, the Surgeon General's office had talked about, if I got this right, coming up with specific guidance on when to close schools and classrooms. Do you recall that the Surgeon General's department was working on that back in July 2020? You may not recall. I'm just asking if you do.
I don't remember the specific document or time frame, but I know these have been collaborative and ongoing conversations.
Okay, and we still have no written guidance on when to open and close classrooms. Is that correct?
To my knowledge from the Department of Health, I don't believe so.
Okay. I want to come back to talk a little bit about, and again, with apologies for skipping around, with respect to the state of Florida's order with respect to reopening schools, at the time it was entered on July 6th, were you relying on school opening experiences in Denmark, Finland, Iceland, or Germany?
Me personally, no.
Or the commissioner? You and your team work with the commissioner,
We had
correct?
a team that was pulling, the latest data and information. I was more in the technical side of what does reopening look like. There was other folks focused more on the research side.
But you're here representing the Department of Education today, and you would agree that those countries and their school opening or closure experiences were not relied on in entering into the executive order. I mean, the emergency order, correct?
I can't speak on behalf of the other senior leadership team on what they reviewed in determining the language that they would recommend in the emergency order.
Okay.
So I can't answer that.
Well, let me ask you, if I were to tell you that Denmark had a 1.1 positivity rate, would you find that a persuasive reason as to why the Florida schools should reopen?
I'm not an expert in infectious diseases. So I'm more on the technical side of running schools. That's what I've done for the last 2 decades of my life.
Got it. And thank you for being candid. Now, I'm going to ask take a look at Exhibit 2. And I think you're familiar with this document, Mr. Oliva. And I think it's maybe a defense exhibit, but I know it's one we've referred to as well. And you're familiar with the Exhibit 2, correct?
Yes, sir.
And it was created by the Department of Education.
That is correct.
And it was, let's go for just a minute, if we could, to page 35. And we talked about, I think your counsel mentioned this.
Yes.
And just to kind of confirm the point, reopening is a locally driven decision. You see that?
Correct.
And you agree with that, correct?
I stand behind that 100%.
Okay. And local school districts, they have people who are elected by the voters in their communities, right?
Correct.
And school district board members, they care every bit as much about students and education and safety as you and your colleagues in Tallahassee do. Isn't that right?
I believe so, yes. In the heart of hearts, yes.
Okay. And they're kind of more on the ground in the 67 counties of Florida than you and your colleagues in Tallahassee. You'd agree with that, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Okay. And so, and by the way, the COVID's impact, varies, I'm sure, from county to county, but it can also vary from city to city, doesn't it? Neighborhood to neighborhood, even.
We've heard of districts doing analysis by zip code. Yes.
Yeah. And so you would have to agree that the folks on the ground in the local school districts know the needs and the risks and the educational benefits in their community as well or better as you and your colleagues in Tallahassee. Fair enough?
As far as the local conditions and
Yes,
knowing their buildings and the clientele that they serve, yes.
Okay. And to go to page 36, same document, sir.
Mm-hmm.
We see, we see the part that says reopening will require locally driven strategies, but I want you to go to the top of that document where it says K-12 schools, college campuses, and child care programs are inherently high contact settings, not built conveniently for social distancing. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
And they're high contact settings with kids, right?
Yes.
And forgive me for saying the obvious, but kids are maybe a little less mature sometimes, a little less informed than some adults.
Some may say impulsive. I have a 16-year-old
Impulsive.
daughter.
That's it.
Yes.
Impulsive, and kids go through hallways and into bathrooms and in a lot of places in a public school, don't they?
That's correct.
And it's a high contact setting wherever they are in a public school, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and then I want to go to page 37. And again, the words reopening is a locally driven decision. And you'll see it goes down to say reopening ultimately must be driven by local data and the goal of restoring optimal conditions for learning. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you agree with that, don't you, Mr. Oliva?
Yes.
Okay, and the local data that you're referring to certainly includes positivity percentages, right?
I would imagine that'd be an indicator, yes.
Okay, and I don't know if you had a chance to review or become familiar with the what we'll call it was internal documentations, I admit, so you may not have seen it, from the Florida Surgeon General's conference notes. But I may just ask you, to the extent that you're aware of what the Surgeon General was looking at, are you aware of any metrics other than positivity rate and RT value that the Surgeon General was reviewing?
Those are the two that I've often heard of. I believe that RT value is that reproduction rate.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm familiar with those. I would not call myself an expert on data analysis or determining regression lines, but I am familiar with it.
But when we talk about local data, are we aware of objective criteria other than those metrics that would be relied on by local health officials?
I would imagine parent voice would be a big part of that metric.
Parent voice. And would you agree that a lot of parents want to have their kids back in school? You'd agree with that?
Yeah,
And yeah, a lot of parents. And probably no one who's been in this virtual courtroom would deny the fact that the education experience inside a classroom is better if it's safe. We'd all agree with that?
Sure, yes.
And I've heard your extremely able lawyer mention that it seems like a majority of parents want their kids back in a classroom. And I don't know if that's true or not, but assuming that's correct, Has the Surgeon General of Florida or local health department officials told the public in their community and given an opinion? Let's take Miami, let's take back to Hillsborough. Has the local health departments haven't given them an opinion as to whether it's safe or not to go to school, right?
I'm not familiar with the Department of Health. I wasn't in the meeting, but that's what I've been told, yes.
Do you think the voice of parents and the views of parents could be influenced if, in fact, a local health department official said, I don't think it's safe yet? Could that affect what parents think?
I think that'd be a factor they would consider, sure, absolutely.
And so far, the health department officials aren't weighing in on that, right? As far as you know. As far as you know?
In Hillsborough, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Now, none of us are here to deny that there's going to be more COVID as schools reopen. You agree with that, don't you?
I don't have any data that suggests that that would be a true or false statement.
Okay. Are you aware of reported outbreaks in Manatee County?
We've got over 22 to 28 school districts that have returned to in-person experiences. Every district superintendent that I've spoken to, in the cases that they are monitoring or asking students or staff to self-isolate, is all been from an adult that had tested positive out in the community. It was not a direct result of somebody being in a school setting.
Okay, but you agree that students can be in effect carriers of the virus. You agree with that, don't you?
There was plenty of other medical experts, I think, that weighed in on those opinions. I'm a practitioner of running schools.
Okay, I understand. You're an education official. Well, just to talk about adults for a minute, you care about the teachers too, don't you?
Absolutely. We consider that when we refer to our educational family, it's well beyond the scope of students. It takes a team, a village to raise those schools and make sure the conditions are right.
Okay, and a lot of the members of the family are reporting positive for COVID, like 192 in Orange since June 1st. Are you aware of that?
I haven't received that data. I believe the contact tracing is aggregated at the Department of Health, and I don't receive those reports by county.
What about Miami-Dade publicly reporting 578 cases from March to July during a period when schools were mostly closed? That's something that would concern you, wouldn't it? They're part of the family.
Yes.
Now I'm going to, again, I told you I might be, kind of flipping around a little bit because there's some things to cover. So we're going to come back a little bit to Hillsborough, because I think it'll help all of us to understand what happened, because they consulted with healthcare officials. They made the difficult decision, and they got a letter that said what it said. So let me go to that. Can we got it? Defendants number 21. So I want to go ask you what your familiarity is with, and perhaps you're not aware of this exchange, but Hillsborough made proposals. Okay, if we could go, let's go 3 pages in to what's been read. Okay. Hillsborough made proposals that included, and I want to direct your attention to September 7th, phase 2. Well, let's go to August 31st. specialized learning centers. And if I can ask you, Mr. Oliva, what kind of students would typically be accommodated in a specialized learning center?
Sorry.
So, did I miss something?
Yeah, Mr. Oliva, I may not have spoken clearly.
Oh,
Uh,
I'm sorry.
Do you have access to the
I thought somebody else was speaking for a second. I'm sorry.
the audio is not perfect, but it's been, hopefully you can hear me now.
I can.
Do you see where it refers to a phase 2 and it refers to specialized learning centers? Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
And what kind of students would be accommodated in a specialized learning center?
Typically, a specialized learning center is also referred to as what we call an ESE center school, an exceptional student education school. And all the students that attend a specialized center school like that would be students of very special need and perhaps students that need the most layers of support or interventions in order to be successful.
Okay. And so Hillsborough was actually prepared to accelerate their in-class learning experience quite a bit and get it started on August 31. You see that, right?
Yes, sir.
And this was, of course, part of the proposals that were rejected, right?
I don't know if rejected is the right word, but
Okay.
that we provided further conversation around when we ask schools or when schools ask us to close, let's say non-COVID aside, it's really engaging in a dialogue. We engage with closures of school campuses with districts often, especially in Florida when we're dealing with hurricanes. We deal with schools that might have water pipe bursts. We might deal with schools that get hit by a tornado. And when we look at not providing access to education on any campus, we immediately engage and open a dialogue with districts of what do we need to do to help support you in getting this school to reopen.
Okay, well, is it fair to say you don't know whether or not this proposal was actually rejected by Commissioner Corcoran?
I don't believe that proposal was ever formally submitted to us for a review. That proposal was provided to us to have a conversation around whether or not this meets the approved plan that Hillsborough submitted to us. And the guidance that they received is that this is a little bit different than what you submitted. And if you want to submit this plan, we're going to ask for some further clarifications, guidance, and evidence. We're not going to say, no, we're going to support you with this opening plan. But if this only opens 25 schools, we're going to ask questions about the other 175 schools to say, can you bring in these vulnerable students at those other campuses as well? And furthermore, the very first question that I would ask Hillsborough is, how did they come up with a 4-week decision and say that we're not going to open facilities to our students for 120 up to or more instructional hours? And I think we should, as an agency, put guardrails and ask clarifying questions. It's about opening up a dialogue and engaging with the district leadership.
Okay, well, let's go to, if we can, Exhibit 52 and see what happened to this.
Mm-hmm.
What's 52?
Okay, and I'm going to read you because the print's a little bit small. Below are the two proposals I presented to FLDOE for a safe return to school. Both proposals were not accepted due to the fact that they were not aligned to FLDOE's direction. So, I mean, this seems to pretty well indicate that it was not accepted, right?
I don't know if that is a document produced by the department. I believe that is the leader of Hillsborough Schools' interpretation of the dialogue with the department.
Okay, but you believe that maybe it wasn't really accepted because the Commissioner of Education asked for school by school, grade by grade details in order to justify this revised plan, correct?
The options in those proposals for 1 and 2 are very different than the plan that Hillsborough submitted and was approved.
Right.
If they were going to move forward with 1 or 2 of those proposals, the commissioner and the team has asked for additional data to support those proposals and recommendations.
Okay, well, we've discussed the additional data as requested in the letter, but assume that there were at least 5 doctors that told Hillsborough it wasn't safe yet to reopen schools. How many doctors should it have been to satisfy the Department of Education? 7, 8, 10? How many do you think was needed to make the point?
I'm
Objection
sorry.
argumentative.
I'm sorry, Mr. Coffey, your question cut out for me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was trying to say objection argumentative, but maybe I'm not coming through.
Well,
Overruled.
how many doctors? If 5 or 6 wasn't enough, Mr. Oliva, 6, 10?
This question goes back to, we're supporting local decision making, and the school boards and the superintendents, as long as their health advisory that makes those recommendations, we're going to support. When we say that none of our campuses are allowed to be open to school, we're going to ask further questions, not around how many doctors it says to approve, but can you see 5 students in a school, 5% of your students, 10%? I get you may not feel it's safe to reopen a high school to 2,500 students, and I respect that. Can we open that school to 100 students? Those are the questions that we want to know and ask as we move forward with determining that whether or not we're implementing that dimmer switch and meeting those assurances in the emergency order by opening our campuses for our students that need a place to go.
Well, we see that they're proposing 3, I guess, significant categories by August 31st and more significant categories by September 7th. And then the rest of it by September 14th. They're not telling you to wait till November, are they?
But what they're not telling us is how many schools and how many students does that serve? If I'm in a district with 230,000 students and 300 schools, our wonder is, okay, if you open up these 3 populations, is that all of your campuses, 5 of your campuses, 50 of your campuses? What percentage of the student population does that make up? We ask clarifying questions and ask for additional documentation and support.
Okay, well, your attorney doesn't want me to argue with you too much, so I'll hold back somewhat, but just this question. With respect to what's best for the students in Hillsborough, including these categories of students, I think you've already agreed with me that the school board members and the superintendent on the ground really know these dynamics better than you in Tallahassee do, correct?
Correct.
And you don't have any reason to believe that the superintendent in Hillsborough was trying to sell out parents, do you?
No.
Let me move on to some other things. And by the way, all of this, well, the original declaration of a condition of emergency, that sort of the precursor to the different orders that we're talking about, was originally, I think, signed by Governor DeSantis on the 9th day of March 2020. Does that sound consistent with your recollection?
Is that the state of emergency? I believe it was 2052.
So. And
yeah.
Maybe I'm missing something.
Yeah.
And he cited as a foundation for it, whereas the World Health Organization previously declared COVID-19 a public health emergency of international concern. Does it surprise you that he was relying on the World Health Organization?
No.
Okay. And are you aware of the fact that the World Health Organization has, with respect to public places in general, has criteria for positivity rates? Are you aware of that?
I've read some. I believe that number has changed as they made recommendations. So yes.
Okay. Are you aware of the recommendations that were made by the Florida chapter of the American Association of Pediatrics. Are you aware of that?
I've seen different reiterations of yes.
Well, let's put up plaintiff's 8. And let's go to the second page. And they say, again, these are pediatrics are what? Doctors who treat children in the state of Florida? Is that a correct explanation for who they are, Mr. Oliva?
Yes.
Okay. And if we go to second paragraph, we can see the objective criterion that they recommend. You see that, don't you?
Yes.
And they say that if it's a higher positivity rate than 5% in the average in the previous 14 days, it's not ready for school reopening. That is the position they take, correct?
Well, yeah, it says basically before states can safely reopen. It doesn't say anything about specific schools.
Right. Do you know how many counties in Florida, things on July 6th were pretty bad and the positivity rates were increasing, weren't they, at the time the emergency order was entered? You're aware of that generally?
Yeah, I believe so, yes.
Okay. And hopefully they've leveled off now, maybe gone down a little bit. But my question to you is, do you know how many counties in Florida have a positivity rate in the last 14 days that is 5% or less?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay. Is it your understanding that that if a child in one, let's just take hypothetically Hillsborough. Hillsborough has apparently come into line, but if a child in one county, if the local school district's plan was not approved, then there would, under your formulation, there would be less funding for that child. Is that correct?
Potentially.
And potentially that another child in a different county where your plan was approved would get more funding. Is that correct?
Well, they would get their projected student enrollment and funding that was forecast.
And just so I understand what that projected student enrollment is, the money that is sort of, for better or for worse, that is a core issue in this case, that's money that had already been appropriated by the Florida legislature during the 2020 session?
Correct. Typically, districts receive that in July.
Okay. So when we talk about, and I don't mean to use these words in a way that seems skeptical, but you talked about compassion and grace.
Mm-hmm.
And compassion and grace meaning that money's, well, you're talking about the fact that the Commissioner of Education was going to make money available that might otherwise not be available to school districts as long as the plan was approved. Is that correct?
The emergency order was a response from a request from the districts to protect or guarantee a level of projection and funding in student enrollment so that districts can plan appropriately.
Right. But you would have to agree that as the Commissioner of Education chose to waive the financial limitation for compliant districts, you certainly had the authority to waive the financial restrictions for all districts in Florida, allowing the individual school districts to do what they thought best to accommodate the safety needs of the students, right? Could have done that.
Well, this is where it's a little bit different conversation, because I know a lot of times we talk about the funding, but the Florida statute requires a certain amount of face-to-face instructional seat time, especially for awarding credit to seniors. Students have to have 135 hours of instruction in a course in a class. And if that is not happening in a class and is happening in a distant environment without approved curriculum or any parameters around ensuring that that is experiences of quality, that could be problematic for a student when it comes to earning a credit and being able to transfer to a higher education institution and other limitations.
But just to talk about the money, and forgive me with so many important things here to talk about money, but in Miami-Dade and Broward, that in the seat requirement for funding purposes has been waived, correct?
They have submitted an approved plan that they're going to implement that outlines how they're going to do that distance learning option for families that meets those expectations for that seat time and instructional hour requirement with this sense of urgency. They want to open schools and get in return students as soon as efficiently and as safely as they can.
Right. Well, every district wants to return to in class
Right.
education. We agree with that. But the point being that you waived it for Miami and Broward. You could have waived it for Hillsbury as well, correct? And allowed them to return to classes basically 4 weeks later than the projected time, right?
So I want to go back to the notion and remind everybody that Broward, Palm Beach, and Dade are still in phase 1, which recommends school closures. Hillsborough is in phase 2, which recommends reopening schools. If Hillsborough would submit the data and the evidence that supports that they effectively have to quarantine every single campus, then we would accept that. But they have chosen not to move that route, and we're still going to continue to work forward with them. I can tell you right now, even when schools aren't open in Hillsborough County, there are students on every single one of those campuses, and they've been opening for summer workouts and conditions for their athletes. Our question is, if you can be open for summer workout, can you also do reading and math intervention as well?
Well, but you're now saying they have to demonstrate a need to quarantine every school building in Hillsborough. Is that what you're saying?
That's what they're doing when they're saying that not one campus in their district is safe to bring students back on.
And
so
again,
I want to know, our questions and our ask for clarification is, does that mean the staff that's painting the buildings and working in the buildings, the administrators, are they not safe to be there either? And if they're safe to be there, can we bring 10 students onto that campus? Can we bring 20 students? I get you might not be able to bring 1,000 of them, but can we do anything on any one of these campuses? We're asking for clarification.
Right. You want data school by school, grade by grade from Hillsborough County, right? Correct?
That was the request, yes.
Yeah, okay. And I want to just talk for a minute about the phases you referred to. In this emergency order, and you probably read it maybe as many times as me and Mr. Wells have, can you point me to the paragraph that refers to these phases?
I don't believe that's explicit in the emergency order, but it's in the executive order. A different one.
The executive order is for, it's not a school-based order. It's for buildings across the, it's for a broad range of public activities, right?
Correct. That's my best of my knowledge, yes.
Okay. And maybe I didn't get the clarity I want, so I'll go back through these questions about the authority to waive the financial limitations. And I'm going to go through the questions maybe a little bit methodically, but what is the source of the Education Commissioner's authority to waive those requirements?
So my understanding is when the original emergency order came out, that declared a state of emergency, state agency heads were given the authority to make temporary conditions to put in place as it relates to deadlines and certain statutes for short-term solutions to maintain daily operations. This is emergency order number 6, which means there was a 1 through 5, and Commissioner Corcoran executed previous emergency orders as it relates to early learning, to bright futures, and some other conditions as well.
And that original authority from the governor, that still exists, doesn't it?
I'm not the lawyer on this panel. There's probably way better experts to speak to that, but I believe so, yes.
Okay. And isn't it true that the order granting the waiver allowed the commissioner to, quote, waive the restrictive funding requirements for Miami-Dade and Broward and other counties? Correct?
I don't know if I follow the question.
Okay, I'll try a little bit differently. The commissioner, in fact, granted a waiver of the statutory funding limitations with respect to at least 3 or 4 counties in the state of Florida, correct?
Yes, so those districts submitted a reopening plan that the department approved.
And the commissioner could have granted the waiver for other counties if the commissioner had chosen to, correct?
That's what we're doing with the approval of the reopening plans, yes.
Okay, so you've given Tallahassee, rather than the school board districts, the ultimate say on how reopening should be done safely, right?
Can you broke out a little bit, I'm sorry.
If a school district such as Hillsborough had a difference of opinion with Tallahassee on whether it's safe to reopening, they are threatened with a large financial penalty if they don't do it your way. Is that correct?
My response is we are going to support the local decisions. When Hillsborough made those requests to put a 4-week abeyance on in-person instruction, we asked for further clarification and detail. If the district was able to provide that support, we would accept it.
Look, in March, the commissioner was able to grant an across-the-board waiver that was available to all 67 districts, correct?
In March?
Yeah, in March of 2020. There was in effect, an order from the commissioner which waived the certain requirements in order to obtain funding, right?
So in March, if we're talking about in March of 2020 in the spring, that calibration for funding already happened in February and was not impacted with the implementation of distance learning. That snapshot in time had already happened.
Well, yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say this emergency order is a result of school leaders and finance directors looking on the horizon for the snapshot that's going to happen in October.
Okay, let me just ask if we have the emergency order dated March 23rd available. Defendants 1. And go to page 3. Yeah, there's a few of these orders.
Which one is this?
Page 3. Yeah, let's just go to section 3, Mr. Oliva. Do you see section 3?
Yes.
Okay. And you see that it effectuates a waiver.
Yes.
And isn't it true that just in terms of his authority, that the commissioner could have extended this waiver through the rest of 2020 because the funds for local school districts had already been appropriated. Isn't it true?
When you say for 2020, are you talking about the 1920 fiscal year or the 2020-21 fiscal year?
I'm talking about it would be sufficient to allow schools to reopen on the same schedule as Miami-Dade and Broward. That authority could have been, this order could have been extended to allow schools to reopen as late as Miami-Dade and Broward without financial penalty. Isn't that true?
Well, this order, and this is my understanding, is the one that we're looking at in March was really in reference to the 1920 or the 2019-2020 school year. Emergency Order 6 is focused on the 2020-2021 school year. And those assurances that were in that order were that we're going to open schools in August 5 days a week. We have families who also have a voice in this reopening plan that know that distance learning was not the best fit for their child. And we have an obligation to provide a conducive learning environment to support those students and families.
Your Honor, I'm almost concluded. I'd like to just take about 5 minutes so I can speak with a couple of my colleagues in case there's any additional questions.
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break. Okay, Mr. Coffey, you ready to start back on the cross?
Yes, I am, Judge, and I think I am pretty close. Mr. Oliva, thanks for bearing with me, sir.
My pleasure.
Now there's a count in terms of when students are to be seated in a classroom for funding purposes. Is that right?
Yes, we typically call out a survey, and there's 2 surveys done a year, and that's in October and February.
And when is more or less, when is the October count going to be taken?
I don't know the exact date, but historically it's the second week of October and the second week of February.
Okay. So,
It's an 11-day window.
Okay, but I mean, in terms of how to deal with school districts that are concerned about safety, they could, should be able to, without any financial punishment, be able to continue with distance learning until at least the end of September, right? Before the count comes in and students are going to be counted inside the classroom, correct?
If they come back.
Okay. And maybe I've got this wrong, or the press has this wrong, but did the commissioner say to superintendents, like pretty recently, before you get to the point of closing a classroom, we want to have that conversation with you? Did he say that?
Yeah, anytime we have a school that's looking at closing, we want to be part of that collaborative conversation. We're not going to necessarily intervene, but if there's a reason that we have to completely deny access, a free and appropriate public education for all those students and families, we'd like to be informed and understand a little bit why that decision was made. Okay,
but I mean, the emergency order did say, absent these directives, and who knows what, I'm not going to speculate about what the directives are. The day-to-day decision to open or close a school must always rest locally with the board or executive most associated with the school, the superintendent or a school board. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And by the way, did Commissioner Corcoran also make a number of comments about an emergency order giving them, the school districts, complete flexibility, and say things like, absolutely, it's at their discretion? Do you remember hearing comments like that?
When you say flexibility, are you talking about in designing curriculums or developing reopening plans?
Well, I think it was in the context of reopening plans, but yeah. Okay, but it's absolute, I mean, I'll use the terms complete flexibility, it's at their discretion, right?
When we implemented the assurance template, let's just say, for how districts are going to meet the conditions outlined in the emergency order, they had full flexibility to design whatever distance innovative learning model worked best for them.
Okay. Mr. Oliva, thank you for bearing with me, and best of luck to you and your colleagues.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Redirect.
Just a very little bit, Your Honor. Talking about your concern with Hillsborough County closing all 240 campuses and wanting information about whether students could be at any of them. Mr. Coffey asked you whether the COVID issue could vary from neighborhood to neighborhood. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And is that one of the reasons why you want more information to understand these schools, which are in different neighborhoods to neighborhoods, may very well be ones that can open, if not completely, at least to some students?
Yeah, and that's in line with the dimmer switch approach, the analogy we've used in the guidance for reopening campuses. If we can't fully open the campuses or flip the light switch on, can we slowly start bringing students, especially our students of the greatest needs, back onto our campuses? And if the answer is no, we just want some of the understand why. And if we can, we want to support you in doing that.
Okay. Now, one last question. Have you had any feedback from the superintendents in the 28 districts that have opened up?
So I've personally, at least to the first 22 of them, I know we've had some open in the last couple of days, and I haven't had a chance to follow up on them, but I've personally spoken to every superintendent that's been reopened. And every superintendent that I've talked to first have remarked about how this is the smoothest reopening to a school year that they've ever imagined. Second, that the parents, the students, and teachers are so appreciative that the schools are reopened, and they say it was the best decision that they could make in reopening those schools. And overwhelmingly, it's been positive and receptive. And every single superintendent has told me by the second day of being reopened, they have dozens of parents that said, I signed up for distance learning, but I've changed my mind and I want to know, what do I do to be able to bring my child back now?
Thank you, Mr. Oliva. No more questions.
On recross, if it's okay, but
Oh, yes, sir. Sure.
what, by the way, Mr. Oliva, is the incubation period so that you know how many days it takes to see if somebody could test positive after a potential infection?
If somebody has direct exposure to an individual that has tested positive,
Yeah, what's the quarantine or the incubation period?
it's 14 days.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Oliva. You may leave the hearing. Thank you very much. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Call your next witness.
Your Honor, we had one more, but in the sense of good sense, we are going to be done. We need to put some evidence in.
All right. So no further, excuse me, no further witnesses.
That's correct.
All right. Tell me what else we need to do. And just, Mr. Wells.
The evidence, what evidence goes in?
According to my notes, when you were examining Dr. Bhattacharya,
Yes, Your Honor.
you discussed Exhibit 26, Exhibit 5, but they were never moved into evidence. Did you wish to do that?
I do wish so. We were just trying to do as the plaintiffs did and wait and move them at the end of the case. So we have several to move in that we have discussed.
I have a system and I always like following my system.
I'm so sorry.
Now, go ahead. Yes, sir.
All right, I'm going to ask Mr. Hill to, you're going to walk the stuff we need to put in, right? Well, just go through one at a time. Just go through each one because they're going to have to say something if there's a problem.
All right. So we'll start with Exhibit 1, Your Honor. And that is a
Well, go ahead and go through, just state all the numbers that you're moving in, and I'll have the plaintiffs tell me if there's any they object to.
Okay, certainly, Your Honor. Exhibit number 1.
No objection.
Exhibit,
Oh, at the end?
Yeah, just do them at the end. Yeah, just go ahead and
Oh,
go
sorry,
through the
sorry.
things you're moving in.
let's see.
So defendants 1 is admitted.
2 and 3. Exhibit 4, 5, and 6. Yeah. And then 7A through 7G. Let's see. Exhibit 8 through Exhibit 19. Then Exhibit 20 through 28. So that's all of them, Your Honor, I believe.
Any objection, Ms. Aguila?
No, I just have one question. Exhibit 7, the composite, is that just all of the reopening plans that have been approved?
Yes, that's,
Is it
well,
really? Oh, yeah, it is.
yeah,
My bad.
it's voluminous. Your Honor, we didn't want to print it out or have to, It's easily available on a link if the court wishes to view any of the plans specifically.
Well, that raises something, and I need y'all to put your heads together to figure this out. I do not have a clerk with me for this trial. Thank goodness I have Ms. Goodman Taylor sitting with me, who's taking care of the technology. But what y'all need to do is to make sure you get all these exhibits that have been admitted into evidence and get those to the clerk so that they are filed with the court, just the ones that are admitted.
Yes, Your Honor.
We'll do that, Your Honor.
Yes.
All right, so Ms. Aguila, any objections to those listed by Mr. Hill there?
No, what are 23 to 28? The list I have cuts off at 22.
Okay, so exhibit number 24 is the curriculum vitae of Dr. Hopes.
Okay.
25 is a composite of the Manatee County reopening guidance that Dr. Hopes talked about. And then 26, 27, and 28 are the 3 studies that Dr. Bhattachala talked about.
Okay, no objection.
Okay, so defendants 1 through 28 are all admitted.
In that case, Your Honor, the defense rests.
Okay. Can y'all come back? I've got another emergency hearing scheduled tomorrow morning from 9:30 to noon. Can y'all come back tomorrow at noon and do closing arguments?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, of course, Your Honor.
Let's do that then, but I still need your proposed orders by 5 p.m. tomorrow, no more than 15 pages, so that I can get to work on those. But we'll reconvene tomorrow. Can y'all do your closings in an hour apiece?
No, easily.
Your Honor, ours will be 20 minutes, if not shorter.
Yeah, Judge, we'll try to more or less divide so that it's not unfair to Mr. Wells. Give me a little flexibility, but we'll try to make sure that the plaintiff's side is more or less equal to the defense side in terms of time.
Okay, sounds great. And I'll see y'all back tomorrow.
Your Honor, I don't mean to interrupt you, but before we go, I would just be amiss if I did not ask you again to reconsider a temporary stay from opening the schools. I understand your position yesterday. I do not mean to be disrespectful.
No, I'm going to have to deny the request on the same grounds.
Yes, sir.
And Your Honor, one last matter. We'd just like to move something in evidence. We can do that tomorrow if you'd like. It's just a rebuttal declaration. It would be plaintiff's exhibit number 68.
No, and I guess I should have asked, is there any rebuttal testimony?
Well, Your Honor, Mr. Meyer can speak to that. I'm not aware of any.
Looks like
We're not going to have any rebuttal witnesses. We may have some rebuttal declarations.
Can we do those today or?
No, Your Honor. If we could put them in tomorrow, we just don't have them finalized yet.
Mr. Whelan, are you ready for yours today?
Yes, Your Honor. We can move that into evidence. It's number 68. We'll make sure the clerk and defense get it.
Your Honor, I think we'd like to see it before we have to say whether we object or not.
What is plaintiff 68 again?
Just a declaration from a parent in Manatee County.
Okay, we'll take that up tomorrow then after Mr. Wells has a chance to review that.
Yeah, if y'all just send them to me tonight, we'll be ready to talk about them.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay, so that wraps up today. I'll see you back at noon tomorrow.
Thank you, Your Honor.